Welcome to the Deeper Thinking podcast. Modern life appears to be organised by systems that feel neutral, technical, and inevitable. Databases record identities, institutions process decisions through procedures, communication networks distribute information instantly, and digital platforms quietly guide how attention moves through the world. These systems rarely announce themselves as structures shaping society. They appear as tools that help complex societies function. Because they appear ordinary, their influence is easy to overlook. The purpose of this essay is not to argue that these systems were designed in secret or imposed deliberately upon the world. Most of them emerged through practical attempts to solve real problems. Governments needed ways to manage large populations. Engineers developed methods for regulating complex machines. Media technologies expanded communication across distance. Institutions created procedures that allowed millions of people to coordinate their activities. Each development appeared reasonable in isolation, yet over time, these developments accumulated. Systems designed to record information began interacting with systems designed to regulate signals. Technologies that distributed images began shaping how events were interpreted. Institutions that measured behaviour produced new forms of knowledge about individuals and populations. Digital networks connected these processes across societies at unprecedented scale. What once appeared as separate innovations began forming a pattern. This essay follows a series of thinkers who tried to understand pieces of that transformation. Some studied bureaucratic administration, others examined feedback systems, media environments, public persuasion, institutional discipline, technological expansion, and networked infrastructures. Each thinker described a different development unfolding across modern societies. Individually, their insights explain particular systems. Taken together, they reveal something larger. The argument that gradually emerges is not about a single invention or institution. It is about how modern societies assembled environments capable of observing, organising, and guiding human behaviour in ways that earlier eras could not easily imagine. The structure of this essay reflects that process. The story begins with seemingly ordinary systems of records and administration. It then moves through developments in communication, technology, and institutions that slowly expand the reach of those systems. Only as these developments accumulate does the full architecture begin to appear. Most people imagine that modern freedom emerged alongside expanding rights, markets, and democratic institutions. The story usually begins with the rise of individual choice. People are free to move, to speak, to trade, to define their own lives. Modern society appears fluid and dynamic, driven by countless personal decisions unfolding across cities, markets, and political systems. But long before that freedom could operate, something quieter had to be built. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, governments across Europe and North America began constructing vast administrative systems designed to keep track of the populations they governed. Offices filled with clerks recorded births, deaths, property ownership, employment, and travel. Census bureaus counted households and occupations. Passport regimes slowly spread across borders. Cabinets of files accumulated year after year, each folder representing a person whose existence had been translated into official information. In a dim administrative room, a clerk opens a ledger and writes a name. That simple act places a life inside a system. The German sociologist Max Weber was among the first thinkers to recognize that these mundane practices signaled a deeper transformation. Modern societies, he observed, were no longer governed primarily through personal authority or tradition. They were increasingly organised through what he called bureaucracy, systems of rules, procedures, and documentation that allowed institutions to process decisions according to consistent principles. At first glance, bureaucracy appears unremarkable. It operates through forms, offices, regulations, and files that promise fairness. A decision should follow the correct procedure rather than the personal preference of an official. A record should exist so that actions can be verified and repeated. Bureaucracy replaces arbitrary authority with rational administration. Yet Weber noticed that something more significant was happening inside those filing cabinets. Bureaucracy does not simply record reality. It determines how reality becomes visible. When institutions rely on documentation, Individuals appear before them as entries within systems of classification. A citizen becomes a number within a registry. A worker becomes a personnel record. A patient becomes a medical file. Each category simplifies the complexity of human life into a form that institutions can recognize and process. The modern world did not begin with algorithms or artificial intelligence. It began with files. Once a society organizes itself through documentation, entire populations become legible to the institutions managing them. Governments can administer taxation, coordinate infrastructure, and monitor economic activity because individuals and resources appear within systems of information that can be stored, retrieved, and compared. The achievement is extraordinary. Bureaucratic administration allows complex societies to function with remarkable stability. Millions of people can interact within systems that operate according to consistent procedures. But the very success of these systems introduces a quiet shift. When institutions learn to see the world through administrative categories, those categories begin shaping how the world is understood. What can be documented becomes real in the eyes of the system. What cannot be classified becomes difficult to manage. Weber described the long-term consequence of this transformation with a phrase that has echoed ever since: the iron cage. The cage is not constructed from oppression. It is built from procedures that appear rational and necessary. Each form, rule, and classification makes administration more efficient. Over time, those improvements accumulate until the structures organizing society begin to feel permanent. The architecture is invisible because it is ordinary. And once reality has been organized into vast systems of records and information, another possibility quietly appears. The information collected inside those archives does not only describe the world, it begins to suggest how the world might be guided. Once societies began translating everyday life into records and statistics, the archives started to grow. Census reports measured the movement of populations. Ministries collected economic data on production, trade, and employment. Industrial firms tracked output, inventory, and supply chains. Year after year, the files multiplied. In offices and laboratories across the 20th century, a new question began to emerge. If reality could be recorded as information, could that information also be used to guide events as they unfolded? During the Second World War, this question moved from theory into practice. In military control rooms, radar operators watched glowing screens that traced the movement of aircraft across the sky. Engineers attempted to calculate where a plane would be several seconds in the future so that defensive systems could respond before it arrived. The challenge was not simply detecting a signal, but predicting its trajectory. Among the scientists working on these problems was the mathematician Norbert Wiener. As he studied how machines responded to changing signals, he began to notice a principle that appeared across many different systems. A thermostat measures temperature and switches heating on or off to maintain a stable range. Pilots adjust the controls of an aircraft in response to instruments and environmental conditions. Living organisms regulate their internal balance through constant exchanges of signals between sensors and responses. Wiener realized that these processes shared the same underlying structure. Systems maintain stability through feedback. He called the emerging field that studied these processes cybernetics. The idea was simple but profound. A system could observe its own behavior, compare that behavior to a desired condition, and adjust itself automatically. Instead of waiting for a human authority to intervene, the system corrected deviations as they appeared. In laboratories filled with early computers, oscilloscopes, and cables, engineers began imagining how this principle might apply far beyond machines. If biological organisms used feedback to maintain equilibrium, perhaps complex human systems could do the same. Economies, industrial production networks, and communication infrastructures might all be understood as systems of signals that could be monitored and adjusted continuously. The dream was seductive. If enough information could circulate through institutions quickly enough, instability might be detected before it spread. Economic disruptions could be corrected through policy adjustments. Industrial systems could regulate output automatically in response to demand. Entire organizations might function like living systems, constantly responding to changes in their environment. Control would not disappear. It would become embedded in the flow of information itself. This vision transformed the administrative architecture described by Weber. The files and records stored in bureaucratic archives began to look less like static memories and more like streams of signals capable of guiding decisions in real time. Statistics became instruments. Data became feedback. A society that measures itself continuously begins adjusting itself continuously. Yet this transformation introduced a subtle shift in how authority appeared. In traditional bureaucracies, officials applied rules to make decisions. Responsibility could be traced to identifiable actors. In cybernetic systems, the adjustment often occurred automatically. A deviation appeared in the signal, and the system corrected it. The action looked less like a decision and more like a response. Over time, the language used to describe complex organizations began to change. Economies were discussed as systems seeking equilibrium. Industrial networks were managed through control mechanisms designed to stabilize production. Communication networks became channels through which signals traveled rapidly between institutions. Society itself began to resemble a system of feedback loops. In such an environment, the question of control becomes harder to locate. Authority dissolves into processes that appear technical and inevitable. The system seems to run itself because adjustments follow signals rather than visible commands. The architecture described in the previous movement had acquired motion, and once societies begin regulating themselves through streams of signals, another realization follows. Those signals rarely travel as raw numbers alone. They move through messages, images, and symbols that people see, interpret, and respond to. The environment through which those signals appear begins to shape the behaviour of the system itself. Once information begins circulating through society as signals, another question quietly emerges. Signals do not move through human systems as abstract numbers alone. They appear as messages that people see, hear, and interpret. The form those messages take, therefore, becomes as important as the information they carry. During the 20th century, the environment through which those signals travelled began to change dramatically. Newspapers expanded into national media systems capable of reaching millions of readers each day. Cinema turned events into moving images projected before large audiences. Radio carried voices across continents. Then television placed a glowing screen in the centre of domestic life, delivering a constant stream of images from distant places. In living rooms across the world, people began watching events unfold that they would never experience directly. At first, this transformation appeared to bring society closer to reality. Wars, political speeches, and cultural performances could now be witnessed far beyond the places where they occurred. Communication technologies seemed to shrink distance, connecting individuals to a larger world that had once been inaccessible. But as these images multiplied, the relationship between experience and representation began to shift. The French theorist Guy Debord observed that modern societies were no longer simply communicating events. They were reorganizing how events appeared to the public. Reality was increasingly encountered through images that circulated across media networks rather than through direct participation. Debord called this condition the spectacle. The spectacle is often misunderstood as entertainment or distraction. In Debord's analysis, it describes something deeper. The spectacle emerges when images become the dominant medium through which social life is experienced. Political conflicts appear as televised performances. Cultural trends spread through photographs and broadcast footage. Even personal identity begins to take shape through images that circulate publicly. The world becomes visible through representation. In this environment, the image no longer functions merely as a record of events. It begins shaping the framework through which events are interpreted. A protest becomes a photograph repeated across news outlets. A political figure becomes a recognizable television presence. A product becomes an image linked to aspiration, success, or belonging. The representation organizes attention before the event itself is fully understood. This transformation adds another layer to the architecture that had been forming across modern societies. Bureaucratic systems organized populations through files and classifications. Cybernetic thinking imagined societies regulated through flows of information and feedback. The spectacle introduces a new environment in which signals appear primarily as images circulating through communication systems. Attention becomes the medium through which signals operate. Images travel faster than most people can investigate the realities they depict. They condense complex events into narratives that can spread quickly through media channels. Over time, these narratives begin shaping what appears urgent, important, or desirable. People remain connected to the world through constant streams of information, yet their relationship to that world changes. Instead of participating directly in most events, individuals encounter them through mediated representations. The world becomes something watched. This does not mean the events themselves are fictional. Political decisions still affect lives, economic systems still rise and fall, and conflicts still unfold across real landscapes. But the experience of those events increasingly passes through the visual signals circulating within media environments. The invisible architecture guiding modern societies, therefore, expands again. Files organized reality into categories. Feedback systems regulated flows of information. Now, images shape how that information is perceived. And once perception itself operates within an environment of circulating images, another possibility emerges. Images do not simply appear, they can be arranged. Once images become the primary signals through which society interprets events, another realization follows almost immediately. Images do not simply appear on their own. They are framed, selected, staged, and repeated. The environment of representation surrounding modern life can therefore be arranged. In the early 20th century, a small group of practitioners began to explore this possibility deliberately. They were not philosophers or political theorists, but advisors to corporations, governments, and public institutions seeking to influence large audiences. Among the most influential was Edward Bernays, a figure who helped invent what would later become the modern field of public relations. Bernays approached public opinion with a simple observation. In complex societies, millions of individuals make decisions about politics, consumption, and social behaviour without having the time or information to analyse every issue rationally. Opinions are often formed through emotional cues, symbols, and social narratives that give meaning to actions long before arguments are carefully considered. If those symbolic cues could be arranged carefully, behaviour might change without direct instruction. Bernays drew on contemporary psychology to argue that communication should not merely present information, it should shape the environment in which people interpret that information. Images, narratives, and public events could be designed to attach emotional meaning to particular choices. Persuasion would operate through atmosphere rather than command. One of Bernays' most famous campaigns revealed how this method worked. In the 1920s, cigarette smoking among women remained socially taboo in much of the United States. Rather than promoting cigarettes through traditional advertising, Bernays organised a public demonstration during a New York parade. A group of women lit cigarettes while marching and described them as torches of freedom, symbols of independence and political equality. Photographs of the moment appeared in newspapers across the country. In a single gesture, a consumer habit had been transformed into a political symbol. Smoking no longer appeared as imitation of male behaviour, but as an expression of liberation. Women who adopted the act could interpret it as participation in a social movement rather than a marketing campaign. The event demonstrated a powerful principle. Behaviour can be guided by attaching symbolic meaning to actions. Once images connect products, ideas, or habits to emotional narratives, those associations begin shaping how individuals interpret their choices. A car becomes a symbol of personal freedom. A brand expresses belonging to a certain lifestyle. A political position signals loyalty to a broader identity. People rarely experience these signals as manipulation. They experience them as culture. The spectacle described earlier therefore acquires a new dimension. Images circulating through media systems do not merely capture attention. They can be arranged to evoke particular desires, fears, or aspirations. Public events, advertisements, and news narratives begin forming a symbolic environment in which certain behaviours feel natural. Choice remains visible. Influence becomes invisible. Bernays described this process with striking clarity. Large democratic societies, he argued, require what he called the engineering of consent. Populations numbering in the millions cannot be governed through constant directives or coercion. Instead, the signals shaping public opinion must be guided so that individual decisions align with broader social and economic systems. What makes this development historically significant is how easily it attaches itself to the other systems already forming across modern societies. Bureaucracies translate populations into records and classifications. Cybernetic thinking treats information as signals that can regulate complex processes. Media technologies circulate images across entire nations. Public relations attaches emotional meaning to those images. Institutions observe behaviour through examinations, reports, and performance records. Each development appears separate when viewed in isolation. Together, they begin forming a new environment. Signals flow through archives, communication networks, and institutions. Images shape perception before events are experienced directly. Symbols attach emotional meaning to choices that appear personal. Behaviour becomes visible through systems that measure and record it. The architecture surrounding modern life is no longer simply administrative, it is becoming psychological, and once influence begins operating at the level of perception and desire, it does not remain confined to advertising campaigns or political messaging. The institutions that structure everyday life begin reinforcing those signals in far more ordinary ways. If symbolic environments could shape what people desired, another layer of influence was already operating in places far more ordinary than advertising campaigns or public demonstrations. Most people do not spend their lives inside media spectacles or political events. They spend them inside institutions. Schools structure the first years of life. Workplaces organise adult routines. Hospitals monitor health. Courts, military organisations, and administrative agencies regulate behaviour through procedures and records. These institutions do not simply coordinate activity, they construct environments in which behaviour becomes visible, comparable, and measurable. The philosopher Michel Foucault devoted much of his work to examining how this process operates. Earlier theories of power often focused on rulers, laws, and visible authority. Foucault argued that modern societies had developed something subtler. Power increasingly worked through systems that observe behaviour, record performance, and compare individuals to standards of normality. Instead of issuing commands, these systems shape how people regulate themselves. One of Foucault's most striking illustrations came from an 18th century design for a prison known as the Panopticon. Proposed by the reformer Jeremy Bentham, the building arranged cells around a central watchtower. From that tower, a guard could potentially see every prisoner, while the prisoners could not tell when they were actually being watched. The brilliance of the design was psychological. Because observation was always possible, prisoners would eventually begin behaving as if they were being watched at all times. The architecture itself produced discipline. Control no longer depended on constant supervision, it depended on the possibility of being seen. Foucault believed that the principle behind the panopticon had quietly spread far beyond prisons. Modern institutions increasingly rely on systems that track behaviour, produce records and compare individuals against defined expectations. Schools measure attendance, examinations and grades. Hospitals record symptoms, diagnoses and recovery times. Employers track productivity, punctuality and performance indicators. Government agencies maintain files that describe individuals through categories and documentation. Each system transforms behaviour into information. But the most important transformation does not occur in the files themselves. It occurs in how people begin understanding themselves through the measurements those files contain. Students learn to interpret their abilities through scores and rankings. Workers evaluate themselves through performance reviews and productivity metrics. Patients interpret their bodies through numbers produced by medical instruments. Individuals begin seeing their lives reflected through indicators that institutions generate. Modern institutions do not simply observe individuals. They produce the numerical frameworks through which individuals learn to recognize themselves. This is the deeper meaning of disciplinary power. The goal is not merely to watch behaviour, but to create subjects who monitor themselves according to institutional expectations. People adjust their actions because they know those actions may be recorded, evaluated, and compared. Observation becomes internal. The invisible architecture described in earlier movements therefore moves closer to everyday experience. Bureaucratic systems classify populations through records. Cybernetic thinking treats information as signals that regulate processes. Media environments shape perception through images. Symbolic persuasion attaches meaning to actions. Institutional systems convert behaviour into measurable data. Individuals begin regulating themselves within those measurements. Freedom remains visible, yet discipline becomes embedded within routine. The system functions not because every action is supervised, but because the possibility of evaluation becomes ordinary. Exams, reports, inspections, and reviews appear throughout everyday life, quietly structuring how behaviour unfolds. Over time, these mechanisms spread across entire societies. Behaviour aligns with institutional expectations not through force, but through habits of measurement and comparison. And once behaviour itself becomes measurable, the technologies capable of pressing those measurements begin expanding rapidly in order to manage them more efficiently. Once behaviour begins to appear within systems of measurement and records, another force begins shaping how those systems develop. Institutions rarely remain satisfied with the tools they already possess. Each generation of technology promises faster communication, more precise measurement, and greater coordination across complex organisations. At first, these innovations appear as practical improvements. A new machine increases industrial productivity. A communication network carries information across greater distances. A database retrieves records more quickly than paper archives. Each change solves a specific problem faced by governments, companies, and institutions attempting to manage large populations and complex activities. Yet, as these improvements accumulate, something larger begins to emerge. The French thinker Jacques Ellul observed that modern societies increasingly organise themselves around what he called technique. Technique does not refer simply to machines or devices. It describes the principle that the most efficient method available for accomplishing a task gradually replaces all others. Once a method proves faster, more reliable, or more productive, refusing to adopt it begins to appear irrational. A factory that introduces automated machinery produces goods more quickly than one relying entirely on manual labour. A digital communication network transmits information instantly compared to older forms of correspondence. A computerized database processes records in seconds rather than hours. Each adoption appears reasonable. Few people pause to question whether the improvement should occur. Efficiency quietly becomes the deciding argument. Ellul noticed that when an entire societies begin making decisions according to this logic, technological systems acquire a momentum that feels almost automatic. Engineers design tools that solve immediate problems. Institutions adopt those tools to remain competitive or functional. Governments support them because they promise growth and coordination. But each innovation creates conditions that encourage further innovation. Systems that measure behaviour generate enormous volumes of data. Those measurements require technologies capable of storing, processing, and transmitting information across institutions. Communication networks expand to carry those signals. Computational systems develop to analyse them. Automated processes emerge to respond to patterns detected in the data. Technological infrastructures begin expanding to support the very measurements institutions depend upon. The environment gradually starts behaving less like a collection of tools and more like an ecosystem. Every component strengthens the growth of others. Bureaucratic archives produce records. Cybernetic thinking treats information as signals. Media environments circulate images that shape perception. Public relations attaches symbolic meaning to those images. Institutions measure behaviour through examinations, reports, and metrics. Technological systems expand because they make each of these processes faster and more scalable. What once appeared as separate developments now begins forming a single environment. Signals move through communication networks, measurements accumulate in databases, and institutions rely increasingly on technologies capable of processing information at enormous speed. The tools begin shaping the terms of their own use. Over time, these infrastructures become so deeply embedded in everyday life that they cease to appear optional. Smartphones coordinate communication and navigation. Digital platforms organize commerce and social interaction. Computational systems process patterns that institutions depend upon when making decisions. Technologies that once served limited purposes gradually become the environment through which society operates. And once institutions, individuals, and communication systems become connected through such infrastructures, the structure of society begins to resemble something less like a hierarchy and more like a vast web of interacting elements. As technological systems expand to support the measurement, communication, and regulation of social activity, the picture that emerges begins to challenge a familiar assumption. It is tempting to imagine that somewhere above this growing infrastructure, there must be a center directing how it operates. Governments establish regulations, corporations design platforms, and institutions adopt technologies. From a distance, the entire structure appears like a machine assembled piece by piece. Yet when the components are examined closely, the idea of a single center becomes difficult to sustain. The sociologist Bruno Latour argued that modern societies should not be understood primarily as hierarchies governed from above. Instead, they resemble networks composed of many different actors interacting continuously. These actors include people and institutions, but they also include the technologies, documents, infrastructures, and protocols through which social life unfolds. Latour called this perspective actor-network theory. The theory begins with a simple observation. When events occur in society, explanations usually focus on human decisions. A government passes a law, a company launches a product, a citizen forms an opinion. Technologies appear in these stories only as passive tools used to accomplish human goals. Latour suggested that this distinction hides how outcomes actually emerge. Technologies participate in shaping behaviour. Consider something as mundane as a form used in an administrative office. At first glance, the form appears to record information about a person or event, yet the categories printed on the page determine what kinds of information can be recognised. A form that asks for a name, address, and identification number structures how an individual becomes visible to the institution processing it. The document does not merely store reality, it organises how reality appears. The same principle extends to far more complex systems. A traffic light coordinates the movement of vehicles through an intersection. A search engine algorithm determines which information appears first when someone asks a question. A digital platform decides how messages circulate among millions of users. Each of these technologies shapes behaviour through the role it plays within a network of relationships. Seen from this perspective, society no longer appears as something standing above its technologies, directing them like instruments. Social outcomes emerge through interactions linking humans, machines, documents, infrastructures, and institutions. A bureaucratic archive depends on clerks, forms, filing systems, and legal procedures working together. A communication platform depends on servers, software protocols, network cables, and users generating content. The network itself becomes the environment in which actions occur. This realization reframes the developments described throughout the essay. Bureaucratic systems connect files, procedures, and offices that coordinate administrative decisions. Cybernetic thinking describes systems regulated through signals and feedback. Media environments circulate images that shape perception. Public relations attaches emotional meaning to those images. Institutions measure behavior through examinations, reports, and metrics. Technological infrastructures connect all of these processes across entire societies. What once appeared as separate developments now reveals a shared structure. Administrative records generate information. Cybernetic systems regulate signals. Media technologies circulate images. Persuasion attaches symbolic meaning to those images. Institutions convert behavior into measurable data. Technological systems expand to process and transmit that information. Each system depends on the others. The invisible architecture described throughout this essay is not a machine constructed by a single authority. It is a network. Power circulates through relationships linking humans and technologies rather than flowing from a single center. A modification in a platform's algorithm reshapes communication patterns. A new regulatory rule alters how institutions process behavior. A change in technology transforms how signals travel across the system. Small adjustments ripple across the network. This distributed structure explains why modern systems appear both powerful and elusive. They are resilient because no single component controls the whole. At the same time, responsibility becomes difficult to locate. When outcomes emerge from interactions among many actors, it becomes hard to identify where decisions truly originate. The system appears everywhere and nowhere at once. And once societies operate through networks of this scale and complexity, the interactions flowing through them generate enormous volumes of signals. Messages, movements, transactions and responses travel constantly across the connections linking individuals, institutions and technologies. When those signals can be recorded and analysed, the network begins revealing patterns that were previously invisible. Once societies begin operating through vast networks of communication, infrastructure and technology, something new becomes possible. The countless interactions flowing through those networks leave traces. Every message sent, search performed, purchase made, and route travelled produces small fragments of information that move across digital systems. At first, these traces appear incidental. When early internet services expanded during the 1990s and early 2000s, the data generated by users was largely treated as a technical necessity. Servers recorded requests so that systems could function properly. Platforms tracked activity to improve performance or security. These signals were byproducts of communication rather than the primary purpose of the systems collecting them. But as digital infrastructure expanded, the scale of those signals became extraordinary. Billions of searches were performed each day. Navigation systems recorded movements through cities. Social platforms registered reactions to images, messages, and videos. Online marketplaces observed browsing patterns, purchasing habits, and preferences that changed over time. Each action left a small piece of behavioral evidence. The scholar Shoshana Zuboff recognized that these fragments of information were becoming the foundation of a new economic logic. Rather than simply providing services or selling products, large digital platforms began treating behavioral data as a valuable resource in its own right. The information generated through everyday activity could be analysed to identify patterns that reveal what individuals are likely to do next. Prediction becomes the product. Search engines record queries that reveal interests and intentions. Mapping applications observe how people move through physical space. Streaming services track which images capture attention and which are ignored. Social networks monitor how messages spread through communities. Each interaction feeds statistical models designed to estimate future behaviour. This development did not require hidden conspiracies or dramatic policy changes. It emerged gradually as companies realized that the signals flowing through digital networks could be transformed into predictive knowledge. If an algorithm can estimate what someone is likely to click, purchase, or watch next, that prediction becomes valuable to advertisers, businesses, and organizations seeking to influence behavior. The network begins learning from itself. What makes this transformation distinctive is how seamlessly it integrates with the systems described throughout this essay. Bureaucratic institutions once classified individuals through records and categories. Cybernetic thinking imagined systems regulated through feedback signals. Media environments circulated images that shaped perception. Symbolic persuasion attached emotional meaning to actions. Institutions cultivated disciplined individuals who monitored their own behaviour. Digital platforms now combine all of these processes simultaneously. They classify users through data profiles. They analyse signals through algorithms that detect patterns in enormous datasets. They distribute images and messages through global communication networks. They observe how individuals respond and feed those responses back into the system. The network becomes capable of observing itself. From the perspective of everyday users, these systems appear as convenient services. A search engine provides immediate answers. A navigation application suggests the fastest route through traffic. A recommendation system introduces music, films, or articles that align with previous interests. Each tool feels helpful and efficient, yet the same systems quietly record the behavioural signals that make prediction possible. The more people rely on digital infrastructure, the more detailed the patterns of behaviour become. Attention, movement, communication, and consumption are translated into streams of information that algorithms analyze continuously. Human experience becomes a source of knowledge about the future. Once patterns of behavior can be measured at such scale, prediction begins influencing the environment in which choices occur. Recommendation algorithms guide attention toward particular images or ideas. Advertising systems present messages calibrated to specific interests. Digital feeds organize the information individuals encounter throughout the day. Prediction quietly becomes influence. The invisible architecture described throughout this essay therefore reaches a new stage. Systems that once classified populations, regulated signals, shaped perception, and guided behavior now operate within digital infrastructures capable of learning from the activity flowing through them. The network does not merely carry human behavior anymore, it studies it. By the time the systems described throughout this essay reach maturity, their influence is no longer visible only in institutions, technologies, or media environments. It begins to appear in something more subtle, the tempo through which everyday life unfolds. The networks that classify behavior, regulate signals, circulate images, shape desire, and analyze patterns do not simply organize society. They alter how time itself is experienced. The sociologist Hartmut Rosa describes modern life as defined by acceleration. Communication moves faster, innovations appear more frequently, and institutions adjust continuously to technological and economic change. Messages that once required days to travel now arrive instantly. News cycles turn over within hours. Cultural trends appear and disappear before they fully settle. Each improvement promises efficiency. Communication becomes immediate. Information becomes permanently accessible. Institutions process decisions at speeds that would once have seemed impossible. Technologies appear to save time by completing tasks that previously required delay or effort. Yet the experience of living inside this environment often produces the opposite sensation. The faster systems become, the less time people feel they possess. Messages demand quick responses. Software tools evolve before users fully adapt to them. Economic and technological systems shift rapidly enough that individuals must constantly adjust simply to remain synchronized with the world around them. The present becomes crowded with signals. Rosa suggests that this acceleration creates a distinctive form of alienation. People remain connected to the world through powerful communication networks, yet they struggle to form stable relationships with the environments those networks produce. The rhythm of everyday life begins to resemble a continuous process of catching up with systems that move forward without pause. The invisible architecture traced through earlier movements of this essay therefore acquires a temporal dimension. Bureaucratic systems organized populations through records and classifications. Cybernetic thinking imagined societies regulated through feedback signals. Media environments shaped perception through images, while symbolic campaigns guided desire. Institutional routines cultivated individuals who monitored their own behavior. Technological infrastructures connected these processes into vast networks, and digital platforms began observing the behavioral signals flowing through them. Each stage increased the speed at which societies could process information and respond to change. The cultural theorist Mark Fisher observed that this acceleration produces another subtle consequence. When economic and technological systems evolve rapidly while remaining structurally stable, societies begin to lose the ability to imagine alternatives to them. Even when people recognize the limitations of the systems surrounding them, it becomes difficult to picture a world organized differently. Fisher described this atmosphere as capitalist realism. Under such conditions, the future does not disappear entirely, but it begins to narrow. Innovations continue to arrive, yet they tend to reinforce the same infrastructures and platforms that already shape everyday life. New technologies extend existing networks. Institutions refine the systems they already operate. Individuals adapt to tools that anticipate their preferences and guide their attention. The horizon of possibility begins aligning with the architecture governing the present, and at this point a quiet reversal takes place. Throughout this essay, the systems shaping modern life have appeared as structures surrounding human behavior. Bureaucracies classify individuals. Feedback systems regulate signals. Media environments shape perception. Platforms observe patterns and attempt to predict what people will do next. But once prediction becomes part of the environment through which decisions are made, behaviour begins adjusting to those predictions. Recommendation systems suggest the music people listen to and the videos they watch. Navigation systems guide the routes drivers follow through cities. Social feeds organise the messages individuals encounter each day. The signals flowing through these systems subtly orient attention and expectation. The system anticipates behaviour. People increasingly move within the pathways those anticipations create. The network therefore becomes more than an infrastructure observing society. It becomes a mirror that gradually stabilises the patterns it reflects. Behaviour generates predictions, and those predictions shape the signals that guide behaviour in return. What began as a set of tools designed to record and organise complex societies gradually evolves into an environment that anticipates how those societies will act. The iron cage Weber described has not disappeared. It has dissolved into signals, platforms and infrastructures that shape the landscape through which everyday life moves. The architecture does not stand above society imposing order from outside. It appears as the network of tools and systems people use to navigate the world. The system feels natural because it is woven into ordinary routines. And yet there remains a quiet tension within this architecture. Prediction systems learn from patterns that appear in past behaviour. Algorithms identify regularities in the signals flowing through networks and assume that future activity will resemble those patterns. The stability of the system depends on the persistence of the habits it observes, but human societies are never entirely stable. Until next time.